"He's been out here since before dawn again." The second cadet didn't answer right away. Just looked down the concrete bench toward the far end of the tin roof, where the old man sat alone on a shooting stool, a water-stained green notebook open across one knee. Why does range control even let a farmer out here? This is a live-fire corridor. The old man didn't turn, didn't shift, didn't do anything except write one small notation and then stop, his pen still against the page, his eyes moving out across the basin where heat shimmer was already lifting off the buffalo grass in slow, heavy waves. The air tasted of brass and caliche dust. A meadowlark called once from somewhere past the berm and went quiet. That was the thing neither cadet noticed. He hadn't looked up to hear them. He'd been watching the mirage the whole time, reading the way it bent and rolled. He already knew they were there. The heat wasn't up yet when Earl came through the gate. 5:15 in the morning, and the Oklahoma sky was that particular shade of dark blue that isn't quite night anymore, but hasn't committed to anything else. The buffalo grass was still damp. His boots made no sound on it. He didn't bring a rifle. He never did anymore. What he brought was the notebook. It rode in his left breast pocket, held shut by a rubber band that had started out red sometime around 2004 and had gone brown since then. The cover was gone, had been gone for years, and the remaining pages were warped from humidity and stained in a pattern along the bottom edge that might have been coffee or might have been something else. He'd stopped thinking about which. He walked the full length of it first. That was the ritual. Start at the bench, walk out to the 1,000-meter stake, don't rush it. Let your eyes adjust to the basin the way you'd let them adjust to a dark room. The valley floor in this particular notch of southwestern Oklahoma did things that no manual had ever fully explained. The thermal inversion built from the ground up starting around 9 in the morning and didn't break until the wind shifted, usually from the northwest, usually around 2 in the afternoon. But the tells were there at first light if you knew how to read them. The way the mirage would already be organizing itself in the low spots even before the sun cleared the eastern rim. The way the grass laid itself down along the basin's length rather than across it when the inversion was going to be severe. Earl read those things the way other men read the paper. At the 800-meter berm he stopped, crouched down on one knee slowly, because the knee didn't love him the way it once had. He pinched a small amount of dust from the top of the berm with 2 fingers, held his hand out at shoulder height and let it go. He watched it fall, not the direction, the rate, the way it distributed itself as it dropped. He opened the notebook and made a notation. 3 numbers and an abbreviation. It took 4 seconds. Then he stayed crouched there for a moment. The sun was beginning to touch the high ground to the east. Down in the basin, the shadows were still long and the air was still. A meadowlark was working through its sequence somewhere out past the 500-meter stake, the same 4 notes it always ran, the same pause before the 5th. Earl had been hearing that bird, or one exactly like it, at this range for longer than most of the cadets on that bench had been alive. He opened the notebook again, not to write. He lifted the front pages carefully and found the photograph where it always was, pressed flat against what had once been the inside cover. 4 men, desert kit, somewhere flat and pale and hot, the kind of flat that could have been Iraq or could have been Afghanistan, because both of them looked the same from that angle, from that distance, from that year. All 4 of them seemed squinting against the sun, 3 of them with that particular look men get when they've been outside the wire long, enough that coming back inside it feels like the stranger thing. Earl was the one on the left. He looked at the photograph for a few seconds. His face didn't change. Then he closed the notebook, replaced the rubber band, and put it back in his pocket. He stood up. The knee popped. He ignored it. He turned and walked back toward the bench, reading the basin as he went. The low places, the mirage already beginning to organize in the wet grass seams, the way the air above the valley floor was starting to layer itself into something that would matter very much to anyone trying to send a bullet through it by afternoon. The meadowlark ran its sequence again. 4 notes, a pause, the 5th. Earl didn't look up. He already knew where the 5th note would land. The cadets had the scopes up by 0730. Earl watched them from the far end of the bench, not obviously, not in the way of a man watching, just present, the way a fence post is present. He had set himself down on the concrete with the slow deliberateness of someone who knows exactly how much each joint is going to complain and has already factored that into the decision. His olive shirt was dark at the back from the walk out. The rubber-banded notebook lay on the bench beside him, closed. He wasn't supposed to be there in any official sense. He wasn't supposed to not be there either. The range use agreement didn't parse things that finely. It just said he could. Staff Sergeant Okafor was running the line. She was efficient, sharp, the kind of NCO who could correct a shooter mid-breath without breaking their concentration. She moved down the row of cadets, calling out the pre-shot checklist in a voice that was quiet but landed on every syllable. Earl watched her work, and something in his posture, nothing visible, nothing you'd point to, settled. She knew what she was doing. He looked down range. The heat was already coming off the buffalo grass in slow rolls, not waves yet, that would come by 10 o'clock, but enough that the air above the 800-meter berm was moving in faint, glassy ribbons. He read it the way a man reads a familiar sentence. His eyes tracked left to right across the basin floor, paused at 1,100 meters where a shallow declivity in the ground made the thermals behave differently, moved on. He didn't touch the spotting scope. It was a range scope set up for the cadets, but he could read the mirage without it. The first thing he noticed was the kestrel. One of the cadets, young woman, probably top of her class based on how she'd set up her position, had the handheld weather meter propped on the left rail of her shooting bag. The rail was in the shadow thrown by the corrugated overhang, shade, which meant it was reading surface temperature, not ambient air. Her density-altitude calculation was going to be off by a number that would seem small until it wasn't, until it was the difference between a hit at fit 400 and a miss low by 2 feet. Earl said nothing. His right hand rested open at his side. The second thing was the mirage read. The cadets were using it to call wind. That was right. But they were reading the base of the shimmer instead of the mid-column, which meant they were clocking the wind at ground level and calling it as the full-value correction. At this range, in this basin, the wind at mid-column and the wind at ground were not the same wind. They hadn't been the same wind at any point in the 20-odd years Earl had been reading this particular stretch of Oklahoma. He made a small notation in the notebook, not about the cadets, about the mid-column movement, force of habit. The third error was subtler. One of the male cadets, big kid, wide shoulders, was holding his position well, good fundamentals. Natural trigger control, but his spotter was reading the Coriolis offset off a laminated card that Earl recognized. He'd seen that card before. It was the standard issue correction card for this range corridor. It was also wrong by a quarter minute for shots north of the 1,100-meter line because whoever had printed it had used the post's general coordinates instead of the valley floor's specific geodetic position. Nobody had fixed that card in the 12 years Earl knew about. Possibly longer. He glanced at Okafor. She was watching her cadets closely. She hadn't caught it yet. She would, maybe, or maybe the shot would just break low right and they'd blame the trigger. He looked back down range, picked up his notebook, set it down again. The heat was starting to build. Get that man's name and have him escorted off my range. The junior officer, a lieutenant with a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield, turned and looked at Earl, then looked back at the general, then looked at the lieutenant colonel beside the general, who gave him a small nod that said, "Yes, I know, just go do it." Brigadier General Preston Waugh hadn't looked at Earl when he said it. He was already turning to greet the 3 Pentagon observers, stepping out of the 2nd Suburban, shaking hands, saying something about sightlines and the basin's particular geography. A man giving a tour of something he owned. The lieutenant walked over. He was maybe 24. His boots were new. "Sir," he said, and then apparently decided that wasn't right and started again. "Excuse me, I need to ask you two. Range cards in the blue binder," Earl said. He didn't look up from the notebook. 3rd page. Agreement's got the post commander's signature on it. The lieutenant found the binder on the bench beside Earl, opened it, and flipped pages with the careful efficiency of a man hoping the paperwork would handle this for him. It did. He read the page twice, turned back to the general, and made the walk across the concrete apron with the binder open in both hands. Waugh glanced at it. One glance. "That agreement is 20 years old." 23, Earl said. The general's eyes came up then. He registered Earl the way you register something in your peripheral vision that you haven't decided is worth a full look. The worn shirt, the notebook, the stillness. Post-legal will sort it out, Waugh said. For today, for the purpose of this demonstration, I need the line clear of non-authorized personnel. I'm authorized by a document that predates my command by 2 decades. Waugh said it pleasantly, which was somehow worse. A scheduled demonstration with Pentagon oversight. Whatever arrangement you had with whoever signed that card, today is not the day to test it. He handed the binder back to the lieutenant without looking at it again. Have range control confirm his status and hold him at the access road until we're done. Earl looked at him then. Not long. Just enough to take a measurement. He picked up his notebook, set it on his knee, put the pen in his shirt pocket. No hurry in any of it. The kind of stillness that isn't passivity. It's a man deciding which things are worth spending motion on. I'll be right here, Earl said. Waugh had already turned his back. He was talking to the senior Pentagon observer now, a heavy-set retired colonel named Draper who looked like he'd eaten 3 good careers and was working on a 4th, pointing toward the 800-meter berm, describing the thermal conditions in the basin as if he'd read them once in a briefing and found them impressive. His staff clustered behind him, 4 officers in a loose half-moon, all of them looking at the horizon except the lieutenant, who was still holding the binder and looking at Earl. Earl didn't watch the general go. He opened the notebook to the notation he'd made at first light and read it again. The heat was building fast now, faster than he'd logged it building in 3 weeks. He picked up his pen, added a second number below the first, a density altitude estimate, worked out in his head without a calculator. He circled it. Behind him, he could hear Waugh telling Draper about the cadet qualification record for this range, talking about scores and standards and what a successful demonstration would mean for the OCS program. Earl looked downrange. At the target board, barely visible at 1,400 meters, a brown smear in the heat shimmer. He wrote one more number, underlined it twice. Waugh turned to face the cadets. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough to carry down the bench, loud enough to be clearly audible to the man at the far end. "What you are looking at right now is a range safety failure." He gestured toward Earl without looking at him, the way you gesture at a traffic cone. An uncredentialed civilian on an active live-fire corridor. No observer badge, no current safety brief, a range use card issued God knows when by God knows who. He let that land. This is what happens when administrative culture gets lazy. When we stop treating standards as standards and start treating them as suggestions. The cadets were looking at Earl now. Most of them had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. Earl did not move. That was the thing. He was sitting exactly as he had been sitting. Right hand resting open against his thigh, fingers loose. Back straight but not rigid, the straightness of a man whose spine had learned a long time ago that slouching cost you clarity. He was looking at something past the target board, past the 1,400-meter marker, past the far ridge. Whatever calculation he was running, it had nothing to do with the general's voice. Waugh was still going. We'll address the procedural gap after the demonstration. For now, consider it a live example. Documentation matters. Credentials matter. You cannot allow sentiment or tradition to override force protection protocols. He clasped his hands behind his back. Note it. One of the Pentagon observers wrote something down. The other 2 looked at their phones. Across the range, behind the low cinderblock range office with its peeling fire lane markings, Staff Sergeant Nadia Okafor had a manila folder open on the metal desk. She'd gone to pull it the moment she saw the general's aide try to hand Earl the dismissal notice. Not because she'd been ordered to, because she'd seen the way Earl held still while the aide talked, and something about that stillness, not patience, not quite, had made her think of the older cadre at Bragg, the ones who only ever stood like that when they'd earned the right to stop proving things. The folder was thicker than it should have been. The SF service record was on top, and she read the first page and then stopped and went back and read it again. The dates ran from 1973 to 2001. The unit designations included groups she recognized and ones she didn't, which told her something by itself. The citation was on the next page. Distinguished Service Cross. The action summary was 2 paragraphs, and 3 lines were blacked out with such completeness that the redaction tape had bubbled slightly at the edge, as if whatever was underneath it had been generating heat for 30 years. She kept reading. The confirmed engagement section was a column of numbers, distances, mostly. A few of them she had to read twice because they didn't seem possible. At the bottom of the folder was a single handwritten note on post commander letterhead, undated, written in a hand that pushed the pen hard enough to leave impressions on the sheet below. Do not restrict. Range is his. Okafor put the note down. She looked out the range office window at the bench, at the corrugated tin roof, at the old man in the faded olive shirt, sitting at the far end while a general used him as a cautionary tale for 23 cadets who'd never heard the call sign she'd just read in that citation. Her hands were very still on the desk. She picked up the folder, straightened the pages with 2 deliberate taps against the metal surface, and walked toward the door. Outside, the heat had built another degree. The shimmer above the basin had thickened. Out at 2,400 meters, the target board stood in the white Oklahoma light, waiting for a bullet that the cadets' dope cards were already going to miss. Earl underlined his last number a second time. "Gentlemen," Waugh said, turning to face the cadets, "this is what 1,400 meters looks like." He gestured toward the basin. The target board was a small white rectangle out there, barely a suggestion in the shimmer. 3 Pentagon observers sat at folding chairs behind the firing line, clipboards balanced on their knees. One of them was already writing something. "Nobody hits that target on a first shot," Waugh continued. "Not without a team, not without a data package that took weeks to build, and not without a spotter who has worked this exact corridor before." He clasped his hands behind his back. "What I want you to quaker from today is that precision marksmanship at this distance is a system, not a man. A system." Earl heard every word. He did not look up. His pencil rested flat against the open notebook page. The shimmer out at 1,400 had thickened in the last 20 minutes, rising off the buffalo grass in slow columns that bent and folded back on themselves, a thermal inversion layer. He'd seen it build the same way 100 mornings, winter and summer both. It did something specific to a bullet's path through the last 300 meters of this particular basin. Something that was not in any ballistic table published anywhere, because no ballistic table had been written for this exact floor of this exact valley with this exact soil composition and this exact grade of southwestern Oklahoma heat. He underlined the number again. Waugh was still talking. He had a good voice for it, the kind that filled space without effort, that assumed the space wanted to be filled. "Our cadets have prepared a full dope package for this shot. Density, altitude, Coriolis, wind call at the muzzle and at the mid-range berm." He nodded toward the cadet at the firing line, prone behind a .308. "They will walk through the solution in sequence, and then we will observe the result." One of the Pentagon observers leaned forward in his chair. Waugh began his next sentence. He never finished it. Staff Sergeant Okafor came around the end of the field table from the direction of the range office. She was carrying a manila folder. She did not hurry. She did not say anything. She set the folder on the table in front of General Waugh, open, and she stepped back 1 step, and she waited. Waugh looked down. The folder contained maybe 8 pages. The first page had a service record header, most of it blacked out in thick redaction bars. Below that, a citation document. The header read, "Distinguished Service Cross," and below it a unit designation that made the 2 senior Pentagon observers stop writing. The narrative paragraph of the citation had 3 lines blacked out, 3 full lines. What remained was enough. The last page was a handwritten note on Fort Sill letterhead, faded to nearly yellow. The handwriting was deliberate, the letters pressed hard into the paper. "Do not restrict, range is his." Waugh read it once, then he read it again. The cadet at the firing line was waiting for the order to commence. The basin sat white and silent under the Oklahoma sun. Somewhere out at the 800-meter berm, a dust devil came up and died in 3 seconds. Waugh looked up from the folder, then he looked at Earl. Earl had not moved. His right hand rested open at his side. His pencil was still in his left. He was watching the shimmer above the 1,200-meter line with the same flat attention he had given it all morning. Not performing patience, not demonstrating anything. just reading. The way a man reads something he has read 10,000 times and still needs to read again. The general's mouth was still open from the sentence he had not finished. Waugh read it twice. You could tell because his eyes moved back to the top of the page. The file wasn't long. A single sheet with the SF service record, clipped behind the citation. The citation itself was maybe 8 lines of text, but 3 of those lines were black. Solid black. Whatever was underneath them had been classified at a level that didn't get declassified just because time passed. Waugh's jaw closed slowly. He looked at Okafor. She was standing at parade rest, her hands behind her back, eyes forward. She had not offered him the file. She had simply placed it on the table, open, and stepped back. Whatever happened next was his, Staff Sergeant. His voice was different. Not softer, exactly. The call sign on this citation, read it. Okafor didn't hesitate, didn't look down. She had already read it 3 times in the range office with very still hands. Pale horse, sir. 2 words. The junior officer to the general's left stopped writing in his notepad. A cadet at the far end of the bench, a young man who had been adjusting his bipod, went still with his hands still on the legs of it. One of the Pentagon observers, the retired colonel, the one with the silver oak leaves on his collar and something in his face that said he had been in rooms where that call sign had been spoken aloud, stood up from his folding chair very slowly. Nobody said anything. The shimmer above the basin moved through the silence like it always had. Heat didn't care about call signs. Waugh looked up from the file. He looked at Earl. Earl had not moved. His right hand was open at his side. His pencil was still in his left. He was watching the 200-meter line the way he had been watching it for the past hour. Reading the mirage in small, slow movements, the way you read a paragraph you have. Nearly committed to memory, but not quite. He did not look at the general. Waugh's mouth opened. Closed, he looked back at the file. He looked at the 3 black lines over whatever had happened in whatever valley, at whatever range on whatever morning had earned the distinguished service cross with those 3 lines redacted, and he looked at the handwritten note at the bottom of the range use record in a hand he recognized as belonging to a former post commander who had been a 2-star, and the note said, "Range is his." Not suggested, not recommended, his. The junior officer was no longer writing anything. Waugh set the file down. He did not close it. He left it open on the table in front of him, the way you leave a letter open when you realize you've been in the middle of someone else's conversation the whole time and only just understood that. He looked at the cadets along the bench. They had all gone quiet. They were watching him. They had been watching Earl all morning the way you watch something that doesn't fit the frame, and now they were watching the general refit the frame, and they didn't quite know yet what that meant. Waugh looked at Okafor. She was already looking at him. Waiting. How long, he said. It wasn't a complete question. He seemed to know it wasn't. The range use agreement predates you, sir, Okafor said. Predates the current post commander. The agreement is 22 years old. Waugh looked at Earl again. Earl had moved his gaze from the 3,200-meter line to the 13,400-meter berm. He was watching something in the shimmer there. Something that wasn't visible to anyone else. Something that required no scope, no glass. Just 35 years of reading one specific kind of air over one specific kind of ground. His pencil made one small mark in the notebook. He said nothing. He offered nothing. He was simply still, the way he had been still all morning, the way a man is still who has already given everything there is to give and came back to give it again anyway. The retired colonel from the Pentagon had been watching Earl for the last 3 minutes. Not the cadets, not the target, Earl. He stood up from his folding chair, walked to the firing line, and stopped 2 feet from where Earl sat. Would you be willing to talk them through it? Not a request to the general, not a question to the room. Just that, straight to the man in the olive green shirt. Earl looked at the fudding 400-meter berm. The heat shimmer had built in the last 20 minutes, rising off the buffalo grass in slow rolling columns. He could read it the way most men read a clock. Move your kestrel, he said to the cadet on the gun, not loud, not sharp, just a fact delivered to the right person. The cadet blinked. Sir, your kestrel. Earl didn't point. He nodded. It's sitting in the shadow of the bench post. It's reading shadow air. Your density altitude is off by about 300 feet. Move it out 2 steps into ambient. let it settle for 90 seconds. The cadet looked at the small weather meter clipped to the post, looked back at Earl, then moved it without another word. Nobody told him to. He just understood. While they waited, Earl set down his pencil and looked through the spotting scope. He hadn't been invited to. He didn't ask. He simply leaned forward, settled his eye, and read what the optics showed him. The mirage was drifting. Not left, not right. It was boiling straight up, which meant most shooters would call it a no-wind condition. Most shooters would be wrong. You've got a thermal inversion sitting between 600 and 900 meters, Earl said. The air is moving at ground level, not above it. He straightened up. Your dope card accounts for surface wind. It doesn't account for what the bullet walks through in that middle third. One of the other cadets was looking at his range card, then at the basin, then back at his card. The numbers weren't matching what Earl was describing, and his face said so. The valley floor creates a correction your classroom hasn't given you yet, Earl continued. Coriolis for this specific basin runs about a half MOA right at 1400. The thermal layer adds upward pressure in that middle band. He paused. You're not shooting across flat ground. You're shooting through a river of hot air that changes direction underground. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his green notebook. He didn't open it. He just held it. Come up 0.8 MOA from your current hold. Wind offset. Hold 2/10 left of center, not at the target, 2/10 left. The thermal will walk it back. The shooter adjusted his turret. The clicks were small and clean in the silence. The spotter confirmed the new hold. The general had not spoken since Okafor read the call sign. He was standing 6 feet back, and he had not moved, and his hands were at his sides. The cadet on the gun took 3 slow breaths, settled. The trigger broke. The .308 hit the corrugated tin roof of the bench with a flat, familiar crack, and then the weight. Long and clean and honest, the way distance always is always exactly as far as it claims to be. The steel rang at 1400 meters, a hard, high arriving sound. Nobody moved for a full second. Then the line erupted. Cadets grabbing each other's shoulders, the colonel nodding once, slowly, like a man confirming something he already suspected. Earl sat back. He looked at the notebook in his hands and then set it on the bench beside him. He didn't watch the celebration. He looked out at the basin, at the heat shimmer still rising off the grass, at the distance between here and there, and his right hand, open at his side, was very still. The cadets were still shaking hands with each other. Someone laughed. The Pentagon observers were on their feet, and one of them was saying something about the correction data, wanting to write it down, asking if anyone had logged the exact hold. Okafor wasn't listening to any of it. She was watching Earl. He had picked up the notebook from the bench beside him, slow, no ceremony to it. He pulled the rubber band off with his left thumb, opened it to the front page, and looked at the photograph for maybe 4 seconds. Then he closed it, replaced the rubber band, set it back down on the concrete beside him with the same care a man uses, setting down something that would break if he let himself think about how fragile it was. He hadn't moved from the bench, hadn't turned to see the target confirmed. His right hand was open at his side. The heat shimmer was still rising off the buffalo grass, slow and colorless and indifferent to everything that had just happened. Okafor walked over. She didn't say anything right away. She stood beside him and looked out at the basin, the same direction he was looking, and after a moment she said, "Sir, that was something." Earl didn't answer immediately. He looked at the 100-meter berm a long time, long enough that she thought he might not speak at all. "I don't come out here to shoot anymore," he said, very quietly, to her maybe, or to the basin. It was hard to tell which. "I come out here because this is the only place left where I still know exactly where they are." Okafor went still. She had read the file. She had read the citation. She knew the names weren't in it, not the ones that mattered, the ones that were just listed as ODA personnel, redacted or summarized into a line about a 2003 direct action mission, 3 killed in subsequent contact. The file didn't name them. The Army rarely did, not in the parts of the record that were shown to anyone. But she understood it now. The morning walks, the dust pinch at the 800-meter berm, the notations in the water-stained notebook he had carried since before some of these cadets were born. He wasn't reading the wind. He was accounting for the distance. The same calculation every morning. the specific number of meters between where a man stands and where a bullet lands, the measurement that tells you exactly how far you can reach and whether it was enough, whether it was ever going to be enough. 3 men. Desert kit. Squinting into a sun that was 20 years gone, Earl picked up the notebook one more time. He didn't open it. He just held it, the rubber band tight around the spine, and turned it in his hands once. The way you turn something over that you've held so long your hands have shaped themselves around it. Range reads clean today, he said. Wind's been honest all morning. That was all. He set the notebook back down. He picked up the small pencil from beside it and made one more notation at the bottom of the page. A number, probably, or a wind direction. Something precise, something true. Behind them, General Waugh had not spoken since reading the file. He was standing at his field table with the citation still in his hands, not reading it anymore, just holding it. One of the Pentagon observers was talking. Waugh wasn't hearing it. He looked at the back of Earl's head, at the worn olive-green chamois shirt, at the right hand open, loose, resting at his side. Then he looked back at the citation. He said something very quietly to the staff officer beside him, something that required the staff officer to get a pen. He was asking for a name. Earl didn't hear it, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was looking out at the basin. The heat shimmer rose off the grass in slow, steady waves. 1,400 meters of flat Oklahoma air, honest and open, and exactly as far as it had always been. They left in order of rank, the way they always do. The general last, after his staff. He didn't look back. Okafor was the final one through the gate. She stopped, turned, and watched Earl for a moment. He didn't acknowledge it. She nodded anyway, to herself maybe, and walked on. The range was his again. Earl sat for another minute at the bench. Then he opened the notebook, smoothed the photograph flat with 2 fingers, and wrote 4 numbers in the margin beneath everything else. The MO correction, the wind hold offset. Data, nothing more. He closed it, stretched the rubber band over the worn edge, tucked it into his breast pocket. Then he stood and walked out onto the range. Not back toward the truck, out, toward the basin, toward the 800-meter berm and whatever lay beyond it, the heat shimmer rising off the buffalo grass in slow climbing columns, the distance shimmering and huge and honest. 1,400 meters is a long way to reach. He knew that better than anyone alive. He walked it anyway, the same as every morning. His right hand loose at his side, the notebook pressed against his chest. The grass moved, the distance held. He kept walking.